have worked with people who struggle with stress, you know, anxiety, depression, you know, because everyone is different. Different things will come up for different people. But social media and spending a lot of time on phones and screens was often a big impact, because that was taking a lot of people's time, and that was the main issue, because people didn't have time to do any other meaningful things like hobbies, going out, let's say playing with other kids, so many other things that are so much more important and meaningful for all of us. But yeah, obviously when someone spends, you know, 5, 7 hours on their phone all the time, you don't really have time to do anything that's meaningful.
My guest this week is Andreea Festeu. Andreea has a bachelor's in applied psychology from the University of Bedfordshire. She has a postgraduate certificate in low-intensity cognitive behavioural therapy. She's worked in the NHS as a psychological wellbeing practitioner, and currently she is training for her doctorate in clinical psychology from Teesside University. Andreea, welcome to STEM with Mr. N.
Thank you, Mr. N. Thank you for having me. And hi, everyone.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Can we just start with a wee bit of background on what psychology is?
Yeah, so psychology is the science of the mind. Psychology is a lot about studying, well, wanting to know a bit more about how people work, how we think, how people behave, and obviously trying to get some answers to those questions in terms of why do people behave the way they do, and trying to understand how they think. That'll be that in a nutshell, I would say.
And when you were working as a psychological wellbeing practitioner, what did that involve?
So as a psychological well-being practitioner, I was doing a lot of different things because it's such a varied role. You can do lots of different things, so it's never boring. So for example, one part of the role will be doing psychological assessments. So you'd get people coming into the service with different kind of mental health difficulties. And that my role was to assess them, see what the problem was, and then would be to make a recommendation in terms of what would be the recommended treatment to help with those things. So that was one part of the job. The other part was doing therapy. So doing one-to-one therapy sessions, doing therapy groups, supporting people on online apps with written messages. So those were kind of the main things in terms of what I was doing at my job at the time.
And I'd said now that you're training for your doctorate in clinical psychology. So what's the difference between the psychology you were doing as a psychological wellbeing practitioner and being a clinical psychologist?
I would say there is a big difference in terms of the qualification in itself. So to become a psychological well-being practitioner, all you need to have is a bachelor's degree and a bit of experience. So it's a bit easier to get into that job role. And then if it's part of the NHS, for example, you'll get paid to do the training, which is achieving a postgraduate diploma in low-intensity cognitive behavioral therapy. But the difference between that and clinical psychology is that the psychological well-being practitioner role is quite limited in terms of what we can do as psychotherapists. So within my job role, I could only do low intensity CBT. Whereas if, you know, now that I'm training as a future clinical psychologist, I'll be able to do a range of different therapies. So not just CBT, but also other therapies such as psychodynamic therapy, systemic therapy, let's say counseling. So, you know, there is more options in terms of the therapies we can use as psychologists when we work with people. So there is this massive advantage. Apart from obviously training for 3 years, which can be quite a commitment.
It is quite a commitment. And you've mentioned there a couple of times CBT, and I mentioned it in the introduction that it was low intensity cognitive behavioural therapy. But can you explain a bit about what CBT is and what it involves?
Yeah, so obviously CBT for short, for cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just as the name says, it's a therapy that's looking at how people think, so the cognition side of things, and how people behave. so the behavioral side of things. And obviously it looks at how people feel as a result of how we think and how we behave as well. And this therapy is quite a practical therapy. So it's a lot about teaching people different coping strategies and techniques to help them overcome any difficult feelings, manage any stressful situations. So any kind of coping strategies that can be actually put into practice in people's day-to-day life and situations to help them overcome difficult situations and yeah, just improve their well-being.
And I know you're still in relative terms quite early on in your career, but are you aware, obviously we've just come through a pandemic where a lot of people were isolated and kept indoors. Are you aware of what impact that has had on people's mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was working as a psychological well-being practitioner when that happened. And I remember clearly, I mean, all the mental health services were overwhelmed with people needing support. And I mean, the impact was massive. In some ways, it was similar to a lot of people because we're all stuck inside with the lockdown and everything. But obviously, it's had a massive impact on everyone, you know, children not being able to go to school, homeschooling, all the difficulties of, you know, everyone being in the same space. It can be really hard, and obviously not being able to go out, get on with hobbies, all the day-to-day things. So I would say it's had a massive impact. We had lots of referrals come in for people struggling, you know, with stress, depression, you know, all sorts of anxiety disorders. So it was a massive impact for sure. That's kind of lasted for some time, even after the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'm aware of some people during the lockdowns who that was when they discovered, for example, that they were autistic and ended up going and get tested for that. So out of the people that are coming in with psychological issues to do with the pandemic, was a lot of it directly caused by the pandemic, or was there also quite a bit of things that had been underlying with the people, but the pandemic had then brought it out?
To be honest, it was a bit of both. So there was some situations where people didn't have any sort of problems before, no mental health difficulties, no difficult situations that were going on, and was purely the pandemic and all the changes that brought. That was a cause in itself of all the mental health difficulties that came up for some people. Whereas, like you said, there were some people, just like, you know, most of us would have some day, you know, problems in our day-to-day lives, different kind of difficulties that were already ongoing at the time. And obviously the pandemic made them so much worse. So, you know, it was a mix of both, I would say.
And the reason I was asking that is because it's always important that we're mindful of our mental health and how we can try and look after ourselves, which I'm going to come back on to in a minute. But before I do that, there's another element that I want to explore, and that is social media, and the impact that it has. Now, I know you've worked with people in their late teenage years and up. Are you noticing, or as a profession, are psychologists noticing an impact, a negative impact that social media is having on people's mental well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say there is both a negative and a positive impact at the same time. I mean, obviously, the positive thing about social media is that people have access to a lot of information, which a lot of people didn't have before. So now it's so much easier to just go on the internet, Google a few things, and get some answers to some questions, which obviously we couldn't do as easily before. So I would say that's the positive side of things. But obviously, there is a lot of consequences of using social media in excess. And obviously, it can be a lot about the things that we look at as well. So, you know, the kind of things that come up on our social media. So it can definitely have an impact. I have worked with people who struggle with stress, you know, anxiety, depression, you know, because everyone is different. Different things will come up for different people. But social media and spending a lot of time on phones and screens was often a big impact because that was taking a lot of people's time, and that was the main issue because people didn't have time to do any other meaningful things like hobbies, going out, let's say playing with other kids, so many other things that are so much more important and meaningful for all of us. But yeah, obviously when someone spends 5, 7 hours on their phone all the time. You don't really have time to do anything that's meaningful. So of course, you're not going to get any stimulation in any way to feel any better.
And what sort of things can people do to look after their mental health and keep themselves healthy in that way?
I would say there's quite a few different things. I mean, one of them would be keeping an eye on how much time everyone is spending on social media. So that can be one thing. Another thing would be obviously people paying attention to what sort of things come up on their social media, because you will get lots of adverts and lots of things that are tailored for you, and that can be sometimes can be not in a good way. So for example, if you focus your social media on, don't want to say positive things, but things that you find important or helpful in some ways. For example, I do follow some pages that I do find really helpful with different kind of psychology or philosophy quotes, any kind of, life skills, following people that are actually role models. So it can be positive if you get the right content that's actually helpful for you. But if you're not paying attention to what's coming up for you and you get lots of negative things like, all the bad things that are happening in the world and everything that's going on into the news, if you get a lot of negative content, that can obviously have an impact on obviously our worries, anxiety, stress, and everything else.
And what about away from social media? So ignoring the good things you can do with your phone for positive mental well-being, but what other activities are good for people to engage in to look after their mental health?
I would say this can be anything that makes people feel good, anything that makes people, feel better within themselves, anything that's physical. So any kind of physical activities, it can be any kind of hobbies or sports, anything that's active, both physically and I would say maybe mentally as well. So whether we're thinking about board games or any kind of hobbies that are stimulating both physically and mentally, I would say are really good. So anything that we all used to do before, we were all overwhelmed by everything that's going on social media. So it can be anything.
That's great. And now we've covered quite a lot about the psychology and what you do and your advice on different things about psychology. I'm going to go back into your past and ask, where did your interest in STEM come from that eventually led you into psychology?
So this is a bit tricky because when I was in school, I was never good at the STEM topics. So I was never good at physics or chemistry or biology. So I knew for certain that that was not something that I wanted to do because I was not good at it and I didn't have an interest in it. But I was fairly good with maths and I would say anything that's to do with computer science. So I've had some interest in those things and I knew I was good at them. But obviously, I did come a bit further away from those sciences because obviously anything, yeah, like, chemistry, physics, biology, they're all exact sciences, which is amazing. But obviously, it depends a lot on people's interest. And obviously, because I was not good at them and I didn't have an interest in them, I didn't follow that through, obviously, going to university. So I chose psychology in the end, which is still a science, but obviously, it's more flexible compared to those exact sciences. So in some way, I did stuck with obviously going into science, but yeah, I guess in a bit of a different way in terms of, yeah, working with people and being more creative and flexible in some ways.
And it's good that it shows that even when you're not good at the core sciences, there's still opportunities within STEM there that you can explore within your interests. So I think that was a great thing to bring up. And obviously, people will tell from your accent that you're not from the UK, but you got your bachelor's from the University of Bedfordshire. So why did you decide to leave Romania to come over to the UK to study?
Oh, that's a really good question because that was one of the things that I talked about in my interview when I went for the interview for the doctorate as well. One of the main reasons was because there is not many job opportunities in Romania, even after you finish a university degree. And that was one big problem. So obviously I do come from a low income family, even from Romania. So my parents were not happy to send me to university in Romania because they knew there is no job opportunities. So that would be wasted time on my side and wasted money on their side. And then I heard about the opportunity of studying abroad through school. And I think it was I had my history teacher who was really encouraging and really nice. And she was a really good mentor. She was like, just go for it. It's a really good opportunity. You will learn a lot. And obviously there is a lot more job opportunities in the UK. So that's how I got here, basically.
And how have your experiences been as somebody with English as an additional language studying in the UK?
It's been a bit hard at the beginning, just like it would be for anyone, I would say, that's coming from a different country, in the sense that the confidence is not there when you're talking, because obviously it's not your native language. So I think it took me just a bit over a year to get used to the whole environment, because obviously it's a massive change coming into a new country, and I was 18 at the time, so it was a bit of a culture shock in some ways. Um, but yeah, after taking some time to adapt, to get used to the environment, to get used to obviously speaking in English every day, meeting people, going to university, just getting used to everything. The confidence came in time. But yeah, it was hard at the beginning, just like it would be for anyone.
And we've obviously spoken there about you having English as an additional language, which is what one potential barrier. Something else that comes up a lot when people are talking about STEM is the gender diversity. So within psychology, because I know females are underrepresented in some sciences and very well represented in others, what's it like in psychology in terms of gender split? Is it fairly equal? Are there more women? Are there less women?
So I read something about it a while ago, and I think the stats are somewhere around 80% females in the psychology. And I think that was studying psychology at an undergraduate level. So obviously anything that's further than that will be less and less males. But yeah, it's very underrepresented for males in that side. So it's a very female dominated field at the moment.
And that's actually quite an interesting point, because a lot of the people I speak to and a lot of the sciences, obviously it's the other way, but and women can feel intimidated going into sometimes things like engineering. But it's a good point though that men might find it intimidating going into other sciences, but we obviously got connected through a male psychologist who's a mutual friend. So that shows that there are opportunities there for men if they want to go and work in that field as well.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I know it's not very common, obviously, to meet male psychologists or psychotherapists, but there is a few. I mean, my last two supervisors for my doctorate placement, they were both male psychologists. So I was very lucky in that sense. And even one of my last supervisors said, you must be very lucky because there's not many male psychologists in the field at the moment. So yeah, there's definitely a few. So I think anyone can make it into any industry. It just depends what everyone is passionate about and following those passions through, really.
which is actually a very nice way to lead on to what my final question always is, which is, what advice would you give to children or young people who are perhaps interested in STEM and not sure what to do with it, or are perhaps like yourself and don't feel that they're good at the particular sciences, but where they can pursue other STEM fields? What would be your advice?
There is a few things that come to mind actually, because I can relate to those kids being in school and not being sure what they want to do going forward, because there is so many options out there, or sometimes it can feel like there is no options. So it can be very different for everyone, and it can be really hard to make this decision because at that age it feels really, really important. So I can really relate to those people who feel like I have to make the right choice because my future depends on it. So there is a few things that really come to mind actually. So one of them would be thinking about the things that those kids are good at. So if you have any favorite subjects, or any subjects that you're good at, you can have a think about those ones. So if you're very good at biology, but you know you hate English, for example, have a look and have a think about the things that you're good at and the things that you like. So I would say these two aspects are really important. Because in some respect, you don't want to go into something that you're passionate about, but you're not necessarily good at, even though you can learn to improve those skills. So it's not necessarily a problem. I'll say more important is to pick something that you're really interested in. The other thing that would be quite important, I would say, especially for young people, would be to try to learn more things about themselves. And that's quite a big thing in psychology, because it's not just about learning about how other people are, but it's a lot about learning about yourself as a person. So how you are in terms of your personality, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses? So again, what are the things you're good at? What are the things you're not that good at? Because this can be really good indicators of the things that you might be good at in the future as well, or the things you might want to get into.